I'm Victoria Bennett, and I spent 11 years serving this country. 4 years active duty Navy, 7 more as a civilian in the Department of the Navy. I've briefed senators, negotiated with foreign allies, and drafted policy that shaped how we support our sailors and their families. I've taken calls at 3 in the morning from crisis zones and turned chaos into coherent action plans that saved careers and sometimes lives. And on the night my brother got promoted to captain, my family handed me a catering apron and told me to pass hors d'oeuvres to his guests. I smiled. I tied the apron. I carried trays of crab cakes and champagne through a room full of admirals and defense contractors who had no idea that half the initiatives they were praising my brother for came from my desk. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Then Admiral James Hutchinson, a man who once ran the entire Navy, asked my father why the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Navy was serving drinks at a promotion party. The room went silent. My mother's face went pale, and my brother's carefully constructed evening started to crack. What happened next wasn't just family drama. It was the beginning of the end of everything they'd built on my back. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, slipped under my apartment door in a cream-colored envelope with my name written in my mother's perfect cursive. I'd just gotten home from the Pentagon, still wearing my gray suit and the low heels I kept under my desk for days when I knew I'd be walking the long corridors between offices. The envelope sat there on the hardwood floor, catching the last stripe of sunlight coming through the window. I picked it up and knew immediately what it was. My mother only used her formal stationery for events she considered important. I set my briefcase down and opened it standing in the doorway. The card inside was thick, ivory stock with raised lettering. You are cordially invited to celebrate Commander Marcus Bennett's promotion to captain. The Torpedo Factory Arts Center. Memorial Day weekend. Cocktail attire requested. RSVP by Friday. My mother's handwriting again at the bottom. Victoria, we're counting on you to help make this special. He's worked so hard for this. I read that line 3 times. He's worked so hard for this. I thought about the policy brief I'd stayed up until 2 in the morning finishing last month. The one about reforming family support services for sailors deployed on extended assignments. My brother had presented it to the Secretary of the Navy like it was his idea, his research, his late nights. I'd watched the email thread afterward. Excellent work, Marcus. This is exactly the kind of forward thinking we need. My name hadn't appeared anywhere in the final document. I folded the invitation and set it on the kitchen counter. The sun had dropped behind the building across the street, and my apartment had gone dim and cool. I didn't turn on the lights. I stood there in the quiet and thought about all the ways I'd made myself small so Marcus could look tall. Started when we were kids. I was 7, he was 10, and we were at a Navy ball with our parents. Our father, then a captain himself, was being honored for something I didn't understand yet. Marcus spilled punch on his dress whites. I saw it happen. He'd been showing off, spinning around to make some other kid laugh, and his elbow caught the cup. Red punch spread across his chest like a wound. He looked at me with panic in his eyes, the kind of panic that makes you understand exactly what someone needs without them saying a word. I told our mother I'd bumped into him. She believed me. She always believed him when I covered for him. I spent the rest of that evening sitting alone at a table in the corner, my own dress stained where I'd taken the blame. Marcus got to stay in the main hall, borrowed a jacket from someone, and stood next to our father in the photos that still hang in my parents' house. That was the first time. There were dozens more. Homework he didn't finish that I rewrote in his handwriting. Expenses he couldn't explain that I loaned him money for and never got back. The time he wrecked our father's car and I said I'd been driving. Each time I told myself it was what family did. We protected each other. We made sacrifices. Except the sacrifices only ever went one direction. I joined the Navy because I wanted to serve. That wasn't a line I practiced for interviews. It was true in the kind of way that makes you ache when you say it out loud. I believed in something bigger than myself. I wanted to be part of the tradition my family had built over 3 generations. My great-grandfather served in World War II. My grandfather in Vietnam. My father in the Gulf War. The Naval Academy ring he gave me when I graduated from officer candidate school is on a chain around my neck right now. I wore the uniform. I did my job. I was good at it. But the military has a way of showing you where you fit, and I learned quickly that being good wasn't the same as being recognized. I worked in public affairs, which meant I was the one who made everyone else look competent when things went wrong. When a ship had an incident, I was the one drafting the statement. When a community relations event needed coordination, I was the one who made sure it ran flawlessly. When a family needed help navigating the bureaucracy after a tragedy, I was the one who stayed on the phone until we found a solution. My fitness reports were flawless. My performance was documented. But when it came time for promotions, there was always someone else whose face fit better in the photos. Someone whose last name carried more weight. Someone who knew how to network at the right events and say the right things to the right people. I left active duty as a lieutenant after 4 years, not because I wanted to, but because I could see the ceiling. I transitioned to the civilian side of the Department of the Navy, a role that technically held more influence than my military rank ever did. I became a deputy assistant secretary, which sounds impressive until you realize it means you do the work while the people above you take the meetings. I drafted policy. I coordinated between Congress and the fleet. I turned vague ideas from senior officials into actionable plans that actually helped sailors. And my brother, still active duty, still climbing the ranks, started calling me whenever he needed something to make him look smart. The promotion party was on a Saturday evening. I drove from Arlington to Alexandria just as the sun started to soften, turning the Potomac into a ribbon of gold. The Torpedo Factory Art Center sits right on the water, a long brick building that used to manufacture weapons during World War II, and now hosts galleries and event spaces. My parents had rented the largest room on the second floor, the one with tall windows, overlooking the river and enough space for 100 people to stand around pretending they weren't constantly measuring each other's rank and status. I parked 2 blocks away and walked, my heels clicking on the brick sidewalks of Old Town. The air smelled like water and expensive cologne. I could hear the party before I saw it, that particular hum of voices that happens when you put military officers and defense contractors in a room with an open bar. I climbed the stairs and stepped into a space filled with light and noise. The room had been decorated in navy colors, blue and gold accents everywhere, crisp white linens on the tables. A huge photograph of Marcus in his service dress whites hung on one wall, his face serious and proud. Beneath it, a table displayed his medals, his awards, the framed certificates that documented his rise through the ranks. I recognized half of the accomplishments listed. I'd written the justifications for 3 of them. My mother saw me first. She was standing near the entrance in a navy cocktail dress, her hair styled in the soft waves she always wore to military functions. She smiled, the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes, and kissed me on the cheek. "You're late," she said quietly. "Traffic," I lied. She looked me over, taking in my black dress and simple jewelry. "You look nice," she said, which was her way of saying I looked acceptable but unremarkable. Then her expression shifted into something I recognized. "I need you to do me a favor." Before I could ask what, she was steering me toward the kitchen area, a small space behind a partition where catering staff were plating appetizers. My mother picked up an apron from the counter, black with the catering company's logo on the front, and held it out to me. "We're short a server," she said. "Amber was supposed to help coordinate, but she's busy greeting guests with Marcus. I just need you to pass a few trays during cocktail hour, just until people settle in." I stared at the apron. It was the kind of moment where time seems to slow down, where you can see the shape of a decision before you make it. I could say no. I could ask why she didn't hire enough staff. I could point out that I was a guest, that I'd been invited, that I had as much right to be in that room as anyone else. But I also knew what would happen if I refused. My mother would look hurt. My father would hear about it later, and give me that disappointed silence he perfected over the years. Marcus would find a way to make it about me being difficult, about me not supporting the family when it mattered. So I took the apron. I tied it around my waist and picked up a tray of crab cakes, each one perfectly arranged on a small round of toast with a delicate garnish. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. On top, I walked back into the main room and became invisible. It's remarkable how quickly people stop seeing you when you're holding a tray. I moved through the crowd offering food, smiling politely when someone took a crab cake without looking at my face. I passed admirals I'd briefed. I passed congressional staffers I'd worked with on legislation. I passed defense contractors who'd sat across from me in negotiations. Not one of them recognized me. I was just part of the background, part of the machinery that made their evening pleasant. My brother stood in the center of the room, surrounded by well-wishers. He looked exactly like what he was, a rising star in the Navy with the kind of easy confidence that makes people want to follow you. He laughed at jokes, shook hands with a firm grip, and told stories about his career that were only partly true. I knew because I'd been there for most of them. I'd been the one who fixed the problems he created and handed him the credit when it was done. I watched him accept congratulations for the family support policy I'd written. Innovative thinking, someone said. Really compassionate approach. Marcus nodded seriously. We have to take care of our people, he said. That's what leadership is about. I stood 10 feet away holding a tray of stuffed mushrooms, and I felt something inside me go cold and still. My father found me near the windows. He was in his dress whites, wearing the rank insignia of a retired rear admiral, and he looked distinguished in the way that men who've spent their lives in uniform often do. He plucked a mushroom from my tray without meeting my eyes. Good turnout, he said. Your brothers made quite an impression. I nodded, keeping my face neutral. He cleared his throat, a sound I'd learned to interpret over the years. Your mother mentioned you might be looking for something new career-wise. I wasn't, but I knew where this was going. Marcus could use someone in his office, someone he trusts. Now that he's making captain, he'll have more responsibilities, more visibility. He needs a strong team. Translation. Marcus needs someone to do his work for him, and they wanted me to make it official. I adjusted my grip on the tray. I'm happy where I am, I said. My father's expression didn't change. Just think about it, he said. Family looks out for family. Then he walked away, back toward a group of senior officers who were discussing the Navy's budget proposal. I recognized the conversation because I'd written the talking points they were using. I kept moving through the room, refilling my tray when it emptied, avoiding eye contact, letting the noise wash over me. I thought about the last 11 years. I thought about every time I'd stayed late to fix something that had my brother's fingerprints on it. Every time I'd let him take credit because it was easier than fighting. Every time I told myself that being competent was enough, that eventually someone would notice. Nobody noticed. Or if they did, they didn't care. Competence without visibility is just unpaid labor. At 7 o'clock, my mother found me again and took the tray from my hands. Thank you, sweetheart, she said. You can join the guests now. We're about to do toasts. I untied the apron and folded it over a chair. My hands smelled like garlic and butter. I found a restroom and washed them twice, scrubbing until the skin was pink. When I looked in the mirror, I barely recognized the expression on my face. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even hurt. It was something colder. It was the look of someone who'd just run out of excuses. The toasts happened in the golden light of early evening, with the river visible through the windows and everyone holding champagne flutes that caught the sun. My father went first, talking about legacy and tradition, and the pride of watching his son follow in his footsteps. He told a story about Marcus as a boy, how he'd always known his son was destined for leadership. I remembered that day differently. I remembered Marcus getting lost during a family day on base, and me being the one who found him crying behind a building. But that wasn't the story my father told. My mother went next, shorter and more emotional, dabbing at her eyes with a cocktail napkin. Several of Marcus's fellow officers spoke, praising his vision and dedication. One of them mentioned the family support policy specifically. Captain Bennett understands that our strength comes from taking care of our people, he said. He's exactly the kind of leader the Navy needs. I stood at the back of the room, no longer holding a tray but still feeling like part of the staff. I applauded when everyone else did. I smiled when people glanced my way, and I felt the last thread of obligation snap somewhere deep inside my chest. Then Admiral Hutchinson stepped forward. James Hutchinson was a legend. He'd commanded fleets, shaped strategy at the highest levels, and retired as one of the most respected voices in naval leadership. He was in his 70s now, with white hair and the kind of posture that never really leaves you even after you take off the uniform. He'd mentored me early in my career, back when I was a junior officer trying to figure out how to navigate a system that didn't always make room for people like me. We'd stayed in touch loosely over the years, occasional emails, A lunch once or twice when our schedules aligned. He knew what I did. He knew what I was capable of. He raised his glass and looked around the room. I've known the Bennett family for a long time, he said. Bob and I served together, and I've watched Marcus grow into the officer he is today. Then his eyes found me at the back of the room, and something in his expression shifted. But I have to say, he continued, I'm a little confused about something. His voice was calm, almost casual, but the room had gone very quiet. I'm confused about why the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Navy, someone who's done more for our sailors and their families in the last 5 years than most flag officers do in a career, is standing in the back of this room like she doesn't belong here. My mother's face went white. My father's jaw tightened. Marcus looked like someone had just told him his ship was sinking. Admiral Hutchinson kept his eyes on me. Victoria, he said, why don't you come up here so people know who you are? The room stayed silent. 100 pairs of eyes turned toward me. I felt my pulse in my throat, but my hands were steady. I walked forward, my heels loud on the hardwood floor, and stopped beside the Admiral. He smiled at me, kind and knowing. This woman, he said to the room, wrote the family support policy everyone's been praising tonight. She also wrote the deployment communication protocol that's reduced family crises by 30%. She's the one who negotiated the new childcare agreements with base commanders. She's the reason half of you look competent when you brief Congress. His tone wasn't harsh. It was matter of fact, which somehow made it worse. I had the pleasure of working with Victoria when she was still in uniform, and I can tell you without hesitation that she's one of the finest strategic minds I've encountered. So when I walked in tonight and saw her serving crab cakes, I thought I'd walked into the wrong event. He turned to my brother. Marcus, congratulations on your promotion. You've earned it. But let's make sure we're clear about who's doing the work. Then he raised his glass to me. To Victoria Bennett, he said. The person who actually deserves a toast. Some people drank. Some people didn't. My brother's face had gone red, then pale. My mother looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. My father stared at Admiral Hutchinson with an expression I couldn't read. I stood there, holding a champagne flute I didn't remember picking up, and felt the entire trajectory of my life shift in the space of 30 seconds. The applause that followed Admiral Hutchinson's toast was scattered and uncomfortable, the kind of sound that happens when people aren't sure what they're supposed to do. Some guests clapped enthusiastically, mostly the older officers who'd served with the Admiral and knew better than to question his judgment. Others held their glasses awkwardly, looking between me and Marcus like they were watching a car accident in slow motion. My brother's face had settled into a rigid smile, the kind you wear when you're trying to convince everyone, including yourself, that everything is fine. My mother had turned away completely, suddenly very interested in adjusting the flower arrangement on the nearest table. My father stood perfectly still, his military bearing holding him upright, but I could see the muscle working in his jaw. I raised my glass slightly in acknowledgement, not quite a toast, not quite a surrender. Thank you, Admiral, I said quietly. My voice came out steadier than I expected. Then I stepped back, creating space between myself and the center of attention, and Admiral Hutchinson gave me a small nod that somehow conveyed both solidarity and permission to retreat. The room began to fracture back into smaller conversations, people turning to their neighbors to whisper questions or observations. I caught fragments as I moved toward the windows. Did you know she worked in the department? I thought she was just family. The Admiral doesn't make mistakes like that. Marcus must be mortified. I reached the far side of the room where the windows overlooked the Potomac, now deep gold and starting to purple at the edges where the sun was dropping. I pressed my palm against the cool glass and watched a sailboat cut across the current, its white sail catching the last good light of the day. Behind me, I could feel the party trying to reassemble itself, to pretend that nothing unusual had happened, but the energy had changed. The easy celebration had curdled into something more complicated. My phone buzzed in the small clutch I'd left on a side table. I retrieved it and saw a text from Lieutenant Commander David Park, my cousin Rachel's husband and one of the few people in the family who'd always treated me like an actual person rather than a convenient resource. Just heard what happened. Hutchinson is a legend. You okay? I typed back quickly. Define okay. His response came immediately. Fair. Call me tomorrow if you need to talk. I slipped the phone back into my bag and turned to find my brother standing 3 feet away. He'd approached quietly, which meant he'd been practicing what he wanted to say. His face had smoothed into something approximating concern, but I could see the anger underneath it, tight around his eyes and mouth. "Can we talk?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. I glanced past him toward the center of the room where our parents were now speaking with a group of senior officers, all of them carefully not looking in our direction. "Sure," I said. Marcus gestured toward a smaller side room off the main gallery, a space that usually held sculptures but had been cleared for the party. I followed him, aware that several people were tracking our movement with poorly disguised interest. The side room was dimmer, lit only by the ambient glow from the windows and a single track light aimed at where a piece of art usually stood. Marcus closed the door most of the way, leaving it open just enough to maintain appearances, and turned to face me. "What the hell was that?" he said. His voice was low but sharp. I leaned against the wall, crossing my arms. That was Admiral Hutchinson telling the truth. You know what I mean? He had no right to embarrass me like that at my own party. I felt something cold settle in my chest. "Embarrass you?" He stepped closer, lowering his voice even more. "I've worked my ass off to get here, Victoria. I've spent years building relationships, proving myself, earning the respect of people who matter. And you let some retired admiral make it sound like I've been riding your coattails." "I didn't let him do anything," I said evenly. "He made an observation based on facts." "Facts?" Marcus repeated. "The facts are that I'm the one who presented those policies. I'm the one who took the meetings, who sold the ideas, who made sure they actually got implemented. You write well, I'll give you that, but writing isn't leading." The audacity of it took my breath away for a second. "You took the meetings with my research. You sold ideas that I developed. You presented policies that I stayed up until 3 a.m. finishing because you were too busy networking to do the actual work. That's not leadership, Marcus. That's theft." His face flushed. "I never asked you to do any of that. You offered. You always offer. That's what you do. You're the support person. That's your role." And there it was. That's your role. As if I'd been assigned a part in a play I never auditioned for, and was now being criticized for wanting to step off stage. I pushed away from the wall, standing up straighter. "Not anymore." Marcus blinked. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I'm done. Done writing your papers, done covering for your mistakes, done making you look competent while staying invisible. You want to be a captain? You want to rise through the ranks? Do it with your own work." He laughed, a short bitter sound. "You're upset because you didn't get enough attention tonight. This is about your ego." "No," I said quietly. "This is about 11 years of my life that you and Mom and Dad have treated like a resource you could mine whenever it was convenient. This is about being handed an apron at my own brother's promotion party, and being told to serve food to people I've briefed in the Pentagon. This is about watching you accept praise for my work and never once hearing you say my name." Marcus's expression hardened. "You want recognition? Fine. I'll mention you next time. I'll tell people you helped." "That's not the point," I said. But I could see from his face that he genuinely didn't understand. He'd spent so long taking what I offered that he'd stopped seeing it as taking. He thought it was just the natural order of things. We stood there in the dim room, the sounds of the party filtering through the half-open door, and I realized something that should have been obvious years ago. My brother didn't respect me. He never had. I was useful, and he appreciated useful things, but respect required seeing someone as an equal. Marcus had never seen me that way. I wasn't his sister so much as I was his unpaid staff. "I need to go," I said. "Victoria, come on. Don't do this. Don't make tonight about you." I walked past him toward the door. "I'm not making tonight about anything," I said over my shoulder. "Tonight is yours. Enjoy it." I stepped back into the main gallery and headed straight for the exit, not looking at anyone, not stopping when I heard my mother call my name. I took the stairs quickly, my heels loud on the concrete, and pushed through the exterior door into air that had cooled with the approaching night. The brick sidewalks of Old Town Alexandria were busy with tourists and couples heading to dinner, all of them oblivious to the small explosion that had just happened in the building behind me. I walked the 2 blocks to my car, unlocked it, and sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine. My hands were shaking now, the adrenaline finally catching up. I gripped the steering wheel and breathed slowly until the shaking stopped. My phone buzzed. A text from my mother. "Where did you go? We need to talk about this." I turned the phone face down on the passenger seat and started the engine. The drive back to Arlington was a blur of streetlights and bridge traffic. I didn't turn on the radio. I needed the silence. When I got back to my apartment, I dropped my bag on the counter, kicked off my heels, and stood in the middle of my living room in the dark. The city lights from the window cast everything in shades of amber and gray. I thought about the expression on Admiral Hutchinson's face when he'd asked why I was serving food. I thought about the scattered applause. I thought about my brother's genuine confusion that I might want credit for my own work. Then I walked to my desk and opened my laptop. The screen lit up bright in the dark room, and I navigated to my work files. 11 years of documents. Policy briefs, strategic analyses, congressional testimony prep, crisis communications plans, research reports. All of it meticulously organized, all of it backed up in 3 separate locations because I'd learned early that in Washington documentation was survival. I opened a new folder and labeled it Evidence. Then I started copying files. Every document I'd written that Marcus had presented as his own work. Every email chain where I provided the analysis and he'd forwarded it up the chain with his name at the top. Every memo where my recommendations had been implemented without attribution. Took an hour. By the end, the folder contained 43 separate files spanning 7 years. 43 pieces of proof that the rising star of the Bennett family had been standing on someone else's shoulders the entire time. I sat back and looked at the folder. I wasn't sure yet what I was going to do with it. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I was done being the person who made other people shine while staying in the shadows. If they wanted me to disappear, I'd disappear. And they could deal with the consequences. The text messages started around 10 o'clock that night. First, my mother. We need to talk about your behavior this evening. It was inappropriate and hurtful to your brother. Then my father. Your mother is very upset. Call her. Then Amber, my sister-in-law, who I'd spoken to maybe a dozen times in the 3 years she'd been married to Marcus. Not sure what happened tonight, but Marcus is really hurt. Family should support each other. I read each one and didn't respond to any of them. I poured a glass of wine and sat on my small balcony overlooking the river, watching planes descend toward Reagan National in the distance. The air smelled like water and cut grass. Somewhere in the building below, someone was playing piano, the notes drifting up through the warm night. My phone rang. My mother. I let it go to voicemail. It rang again 5 minutes later. My father. Voicemail. Then Marcus. Voicemail. I finished my wine and went inside, closing the balcony door behind me. The notifications kept coming. I turned my phone completely off and plugged it in to charge on the kitchen counter. The silence that followed was profound. For the first time in years, maybe ever, I was completely unreachable. No one could ask me for anything. No one could demand my time or attention or labor. I was just alone in my apartment with my own thoughts, and it felt like the first full breath I'd taken in a decade. Sunday morning arrived gray and cool, the kind of day that feels like it might rain but never quite commits. I woke up early out of habit, made coffee, and turned my phone back on. The screen lit up with notifications. 23 missed calls. 17 text messages. 3 voicemails. I set the phone down without reading any of it and took my coffee to the balcony. The city was quiet in that specific Sunday morning way, the traffic lighter, the air softer. I sat and watched the river and tried to figure out what I actually wanted. The answer surprised me. I wanted to stop performing. I wanted to stop managing other people's emotions and reputations. I wanted to do work that had my name on it, work that people could see and evaluate on its own merits. I wanted to stop being grateful for scraps of recognition while watching mediocre men feast on credit for my ideas. I wanted to be exactly as ambitious and demanding as I'd always secretly been but had learned to hide because ambitious women made people uncomfortable. I wanted to stop making myself smaller so other people could feel bigger. The realization sat in my chest like something both terrifying and exhilarating. I'd spent so long being who my family needed me to be that I'd almost forgotten there was another option. I could just be myself. And if they didn't like it, that was no longer my problem to solve. Around noon, someone knocked on my door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and the knock had an insistent quality that made me immediately suspicious. I looked through the peephole and saw my mother standing in the hallway, her purse clutched in both hands. I considered not answering. The option was genuinely on the table. But I also knew that she'd stand there knocking until I did, and I didn't want to give my neighbors a show. I opened the door. My mother's face was carefully composed, the expression she wore when she was trying very hard not to show how upset she was. "Can I come in?" she asked. I stepped aside and let her enter. She walked into my living room and stood looking around like she'd never been here before. Even though she'd helped me move in 2 years ago, the apartment was neat and minimal, everything in its place, and I wondered what she was looking for. Proof that I was falling apart, maybe. Evidence that I needed fixing. She turned to face me. "We need to talk about last night." I closed the door and leaned against it. "Okay. Your father and I are very concerned about the way you behaved." "The way I behaved," I repeated. "Yes," she said, her voice gaining confidence. "You embarrassed Marcus in front of his colleagues and superiors. You made a scene." "Admiral Hutchinson made a scene," I corrected. "I just stood there." "You could have redirected him. You could have downplayed your role. Instead, you just let him make it seem like Marcus has been taking advantage of you." "Mom, Marcus has been taking advantage of me. For years. You know that." Her mouth tightened. "That's not fair. You've helped each other. That's what family does." I pushed away from the door and walked to the window. The river was gray under the cloudy sky, choppy with wind. "Show me one time," I said without turning around, "that Marcus helped me with my career. One time he gave me credit. One time he went out of his way to make sure people knew what I'd contributed." Silence. I turned to look at her. She was staring at her hands. "That's different," she said quietly. "How?" "He's in uniform. He's in a visible position. People expect certain things." "And what do they expect from me?" I asked. She looked up, her eyes bright with something that might have been tears or might have been frustration. "They expect you to be supportive, to be part of the team, to understand that your brother's success reflects well on the whole family." There it was again. The same logic that had governed my entire life. My value wasn't in what I accomplished. It was in how well I supported someone else's accomplishments. I walked back to the door and opened it. "I think you should go." "Victoria, please." "I'm not going to apologize for what happened last night," I said. "And I'm not going to keep pretending that being invisible is the same thing as being valued. If Marcus wants to succeed, he can do it on his own merit. I'm done writing his papers." My mother stood slowly, her purse clutched against her stomach like armor. "You're making a mistake," she said. "This kind of attitude will only hurt you in the long run." "Then I guess I'll deal with the consequences," I said. She walked to the door and paused in front of me. "Your father is very disappointed," she said quietly. It was meant to land like a blow, and once upon a time it would have. But standing there in my own doorway in my own home, with the evidence of my own career and competence surrounding me, I found that I didn't particularly care whether my father was disappointed or not. I nodded once. "I'm sorry to hear that." She searched my face for something. Some sign of the daughter who would immediately start trying to fix things and make everyone comfortable again. When she didn't find it, her expression shifted into something colder. "We'll talk when you're being more reasonable," she said. Then she left. I closed the door and leaned against it, my eyes shut. My hands were steady. My breathing was calm. And I realized something that felt like both a loss and a liberation. I wasn't going to get what I needed from these people. Not understanding, not acknowledgement, not respect. They were never going to suddenly see me differently or apologize for the years of taking me for granted. They were too invested in the story they'd been telling themselves. The one where Marcus was the golden child, and I was the supporting character who existed to make his shine brighter. If I wanted something different, I was going to have to build it myself. I spent the rest of Sunday organizing my files, reviewing my documentation, and drafting an email I wasn't sure I'd send. The email was to Admiral Hutchinson, thanking him for his words at the party and asking if he had time for coffee in the coming week. I read it over a dozen times, adjusting the tone, making sure I sounded professional and not desperate or angry. Finally, around 6 in the evening, I sent it. His reply came back in less than 10 minutes. Tuesday morning. Virtue feed and grain. 8 o'clock. Looking forward to it. I stared at the message for a long time. Then I opened a new document and started making a list of everything I wanted to say. Monday morning I went into the Pentagon like nothing had happened. I wore my usual gray suit, carried my usual briefcase, badged through security with my usual polite nod to the guards. I took the elevator to the earring, walked down the familiar corridor past the usual mix of officers and civilians, and settled into my office with the door half open the way I always did. My assistant, a sharp young woman named Jennifer who'd been with me for 2 years, appeared in the doorway with coffee. "You're trending," she said without preamble. I looked up from my computer. "What?" She held out her phone. A photo of me and Admiral Hutchinson at the party, his hand on my shoulder, both of us holding champagne glasses. Someone had posted it to a private Navy spouses Facebook group with the caption, "Finally someone said it out loud." The post had been shared 400 times. There were screenshots on Twitter. Someone had even written a short thread about women in defense doing invisible labor while men collected promotions. My name was mentioned in a dozen different posts. I handed the phone back to Jennifer. "Great." She grinned. "I think it's kind of amazing actually. Your brother's office has called 3 times this morning. Tell them I'm in meetings all day." "Already did," she said. She paused. "For what it's worth, everyone on this floor knows what you do. We've always known." I looked at her. This young woman who'd watched me navigate bureaucracy and crisis and impossible demands for 2 years, and felt something in my chest crack open slightly. "Thank you," I said quietly. She nodded and disappeared back to her desk. The morning passed in the usual rhythm of emails and briefings and phone calls. Around 10:30 my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "This is Captain Elizabeth Morrison. We met briefly at your brother's party." I wanted to reach out and say that Admiral Hutchinson's comments really resonated. I've experienced similar dynamics in my career. If you ever want to talk over coffee, I'd welcome it. I stared at the message. Captain Morrison was a rising officer I'd seen from a distance at various functions but had never actually spoken to. I typed back quickly. "I'd like that. Thank you for reaching out." Her response came immediately. "I'll send you my contact info. I'm serious about the coffee. We have to look out for each other." I set the phone down and turned back to my computer, but I couldn't quite focus. Something was shifting. The story was spreading beyond the room where it happened. People were paying attention, and I wasn't sure yet whether that was good or dangerous or both. At lunch, I walked down to the courtyard in the center of the Pentagon, the open air space where people grabbed food trucks and phone reception. I bought a sandwich I didn't really want and found an empty bench in the sun. My phone rang. David Park, my cousin's husband. I answered. "Hey," I said. "I heard you had an interesting weekend," he said. His voice was warm and slightly amused. "That's one word for it." "Listen," he continued, his tone shifting slightly. "I don't want to get into specifics over the phone, but I think we should talk. There are some things happening with personnel assignments that you should probably know about." My stomach tightened. "What kind of things?" "The kind that involve your name and your brother's name showing up in the same email chains. I can't say more right now, but let's meet somewhere off base." "Tomorrow afternoon?" "I'm meeting Admiral Hutchinson tomorrow morning." "Wednesday then. I'll text you a location." I hung up and stared at the sandwich in my lap. The bread had already started to get soggy. Around me, people in uniform and business casual moved through their lunch breaks, everyone absorbed in their own small dramas and deadlines. And I sat there wondering exactly how far my family was willing to go to protect Marcus's reputation. The rest of the day passed in a haze of routine tasks that felt surreal given everything else happening. I drafted a memo on base housing policy. I reviewed a speech for the assistant secretary. I answered emails from congressional staffers who wanted information about programs I designed, but that someone else would ultimately present. It all felt both completely normal and utterly absurd. Around 4 o'clock my father called. I looked at his name on the screen for a long moment before answering. "Hello." His voice was formal, the tone he used when he was speaking from a script he'd prepared. "Your mother told me about your conversation yesterday. I need you to understand how serious this situation has become." I leaned back in my chair, looking out my narrow window at the parking lot below. "What situation is that, Dad?" "You've created a problem for your brother's career. People are talking. There are questions being raised about his credibility." "That's not my fault," I said. "You could fix it. You could send an email to Admiral Hutchinson clarifying that you were simply providing staff support, that Marcus was the strategic lead on those initiatives. You could make a public statement." "Could lie, you mean?" "Victoria," your father's voice carried a warning edge I'd heard 1,000 times. You're being selfish. This isn't just about you. Marcus has a career to protect. Families make sacrifices. I've made sacrifices for 11 years, I said quietly. Maybe it's someone else's turn. There was a long pause. When he spoke again, his voice was cold. I'm very disappointed in you. You're acting like a child. I'm acting like someone who's tired of being used, I said. There's a difference. He hung up without responding. I set the phone down and turned back to my computer, but the words on the screen blurred. I realized I was crying, just a little, not from sadness but from the sheer exhaustion of it all. The constant weight of trying to be good enough, useful enough, invisible enough. The endless calibration of making everyone else comfortable. I was so tired. Jennifer appeared in my doorway. You okay? I wiped my eyes quickly. Yeah, just a long day. She looked at me with an expression that was far too knowing for someone in her mid-20s. You know you don't have to protect them, right? Everyone knows what actually happened. I know, I said. But knowing and acting on it were two different things, and I was still learning how to close that gap. By the time I left the Pentagon that evening, the sun was low and golden, turning the Potomac into liquid amber. I sat in traffic on the bridge back to Arlington and thought about Admiral Hutchinson's words. Why is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Navy serving drinks? The question had been rhetorical, but it deserved a real answer. I'd been serving drinks, metaphorically and literally, because I believed that making myself useful would eventually translate into being valued. I believed that if I was just competent enough, just helpful enough, just selfless enough, someone would finally see me and say, you deserve more. But that wasn't how it worked. Competence without boundaries was just exploitation with better optics. People didn't value what they didn't have to work for. And I'd made myself so available, so consistently reliable, that my family had stopped seeing my labor as a choice I was making. They saw it as a resource that belonged to them. When I got home, I changed into comfortable clothes and made dinner. Something simple that required no thinking. I ate at my kitchen counter watching the lights come on across the river. My phone sat face down beside me and I didn't check it. Whatever messages were waiting could wait until I was ready. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe never. For tonight, I was going to sit in my own space and remember what it felt like to owe nobody anything. The feeling was strange and unfamiliar and absolutely terrifying. It was also the closest thing to peace I'd felt in years. Tuesday morning arrived with clear skies and the kind of crisp air that makes Washington feel almost optimistic. I woke up before my alarm, showered, and dressed carefully in a navy blazer and white blouse, the uniform of competent professional women in this city. I looked at myself in the mirror and practiced the expression I wanted to wear. Not angry, not desperate, just calm and clear about what I needed. Virtue Feed and Grain sat on the Alexandria waterfront in a restored brick building that had probably been a warehouse in another life. I arrived 10 minutes early and found a table by the windows overlooking the river. The morning light poured through the glass, and I ordered coffee while I waited. The place smelled like fresh bread and espresso, and the low hum of conversation from other tables created a comfortable backdrop. Admiral Hutchinson arrived exactly on time, moving through the restaurant with the easy confidence of someone who'd spent decades walking into rooms and having people automatically defer to him. He was wearing khakis and a blue Oxford shirt, casual by his standards, but he still carried himself like someone in uniform. He spotted me and smiled, the kind of genuine expression that immediately put me at ease. Victoria, he said, settling into the chair across from me. Thank you for meeting me. Thank you for what you said Saturday night, I replied. He waved a hand dismissively. I said what needed to be said. I've watched too many talented people get buried by proximity to mediocrity. The server appeared and he ordered coffee and a pastry, then turned his full attention back to me. So tell me what's really going on. Not the polite version. The true version. I took a breath and started talking. I told him about the years of writing policy papers that Marcus presented as his own work. About the crisis communications plans I drafted at midnight that bore his signature by morning. About the research and analysis and strategic thinking that somehow always became his ideas by the time they reached anyone who mattered. I told him about the promotion party, about being handed an apron, about standing in that room serving food to people I'd briefed in secure facilities. I told him about my family's response, the calls and texts and demands that I fix the situation by making myself smaller again. Admiral Hutchinson listened without interrupting. his coffee cooling untouched in front of him. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the river where early morning kayakers were cutting through the calm water. "Your brother is going to have a difficult career ahead of him," he said finally. "Not because of anything you've done, but because he's never actually had to develop the skills everyone thinks he has. Eventually someone's going to hand him a real crisis, and he won't know what to do with it." I thought about that. I'd spent so long focused on my own invisibility that I hadn't really considered what it meant for Marcus. He'd been promoted based on work he didn't do, praised for insights he didn't have, given responsibility that assumed competence he'd never actually built. In some ways, I'd done him as much harm as I'd done myself. "What do you think I should do?" I asked. The Admiral turned back to me, his expression serious. "What do you want to do? That's the real question. Not what will make your family happy or what will smooth things over. What do you actually want?" I've been asking myself that question since Sunday, and the answer had been slowly taking shape. "I want credit for my own work," I said. "I want to stop hiding behind other people. I want to build something that has my name on it, where my success or failure is visible and belongs to me." He nodded slowly. "That's a good answer. It's also going to require you to burn some bridges." "I know," I said. He leaned forward slightly. "I've been consulting with a few defense firms since I retired. Smart people doing important work on naval strategy and policy. They need someone who understands how the Pentagon actually works, someone who can translate between the uniform side and the civilian bureaucracy, someone who can write and think strategically and doesn't need their hand held." He paused. "I think you'd be very good at it. And I think they'd pay you what you're actually worth." My heart started beating faster. "Are you offering me a job?" "I'm offering you a conversation with people who are looking for someone like you. What you do with that conversation is up to you." "But Victoria," he leaned back and picked up his coffee, "if you stay where you are, trying to get recognition from people who benefit from your invisibility, you're going to spend the next 20 years having the same fight you're having right now. Sometimes the only way to win is to stop playing their game." I sat with that for a moment, turning it over in my mind. Leaving the Department of the Navy felt enormous. I'd spent 11 years building expertise and relationships and credibility. Walking away meant starting over, building new networks, proving myself to new people. But staying meant continuing to feed a system that would never actually feed me back. "How soon would they want to talk?" I asked. The Admiral smiled. "I can make a call this afternoon. They could meet you by the end of the week." I thought about the files on my laptop, the evidence I'd compiled. I thought about my father's disappointment and my mother's cold silence and Marcus's genuine confusion that I might want anything different. I thought about Jennifer's words. "You don't have to protect them. Set up the meeting," I said. The Admiral nodded and pulled out his phone, tapping out a quick message. "Done," he said. "You'll hear from someone named Margaret Klein by this afternoon. She runs strategy and policy consulting. Very sharp, very fair. She'll appreciate what you bring to the table." We talked for another hour about the industry, about what consulting work actually looked like, about the projects his firm was handling. He told me stories about navigating the shift from military to civilian life, about the adjustment of not having rank to rely on, about learning to sell yourself in a way the military never prepared you for. It was the kind of conversation I'd needed for years, the kind of mentorship that sees you as a whole person, rather than a useful tool. When we finally stood to leave, he put a hand on my shoulder. "You're going to be fine," he said. "Better than fine. You're finally going to get to see what you can do when you're not spending all your energy making someone else look good." I drove back to Arlington feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not happiness exactly, but possibility. The sense that there might be a path forward that didn't require me to keep performing a version of myself that made everyone else comfortable. My phone buzzed as I pulled into my parking garage. A text from David Park. "Can you meet me at Gravelly Point at 2? I replied quickly. "See you there." Gravelly Point Park sits at the north end of Reagan National Airport, a strip of grass along the Potomac where planes descend so low overhead, you can almost read the registration numbers on their bellies. It's oddly peaceful despite the noise, or maybe because of it. The roar of the engines creates a kind of privacy, a bubble where conversation disappears into the sound. I arrived a few minutes early and found David already there, standing near the water in jeans and a Georgetown sweatshirt. He worked in Navy personnel, managing officer assignments and promotions. And he'd always been the family member who asked how I was doing without following it up with a request for something. We'd gotten coffee a handful of times over the years, traded books, had actual conversations about things that mattered. He saw me approaching and waved, then gestured toward a bench away from the cluster of plane watchers. "This is very cloak and dagger," I said, sitting down. He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm probably being paranoid, but I wanted to talk somewhere that definitely doesn't have security cameras or other Navy personnel around." That got my attention. "What's going on?" He pulled out his phone and opened an email, turning the screen so I could see it. The subject line read Personnel Review Bennett, Marcus. The email was from a captain I didn't know, addressed to several people in the personnel office. I scanned it quickly. The message was carefully worded, bureaucratic language that took a minute to parse, but the substance was clear. Someone had requested a review of Marcus's recent performance evaluations and promotion justifications. There were questions about attribution on several policy initiatives he'd claimed as his own work. Someone had apparently submitted documentation suggesting that credit had been misattributed. I looked up at David, who submitted the documentation. "That's where it gets interesting," he said. "The request came through Admiral Hutchinson's office, but the documentation itself appears to have come from someone inside the Department of the Navy with direct knowledge of the projects." He paused. "The metadata on the files suggests they were compiled over the weekend." I stared at him. "I didn't send anything to anyone." "I know you didn't," David said. "But someone did. Someone who had access to the same files you would have access to, and who knew exactly what questions to raise." A plane roared overhead so low I could see the landing gear extended. We both waited for it to pass before continuing. "Do you know who?" I asked. David shook his head. "The submission was anonymous, routed through a secure tip line that personnel maintains for reporting misconduct. But whoever did it knew exactly how the system works. They cited specific regulations, referenced the right policy documents, provided enough evidence to trigger a mandatory review without providing so much that it would be obvious where it came from." I tried to process this. Someone was helping me, or at least someone was moving against Marcus, and they'd done it in a way that protected their identity while ensuring the accusations would be taken seriously. "Who else knows about this?" I asked. "Right now, the review board, which is 3 senior captains and a rear admiral, the people and personnel who received the initial complaint, and your brother as of this morning. They had to notify him that a review was being initiated." David looked at me carefully. "Victoria, this is going to get ugly. Marcus is going to know this came from you somehow, even if he can't prove it. Your family is going to close ranks. And the Navy takes this kind of thing seriously. If the review finds that he materially misrepresented his contributions to get promoted, it could derail his career." I should have felt triumphant. This was accountability. This was the system finally looking at the truth instead of the comfortable story. But what I actually felt was a complicated knot of vindication and dread. "I didn't do this," I said again. "I know," David repeated, "but that might not matter. The appearance is going to be that you embarrassed him at his promotion party and then filed a complaint. The timeline alone is going to make people assume." "What do you think I should do?" I asked. He was quiet for a moment, watching another plane make its descent. "Honestly, I think you should get ahead of this. Document everything from your side. If they interview you, and they probably will, be completely truthful but don't volunteer information they don't ask for. And Victoria," he turned to look at me directly, "be prepared for your family to choose Marcus. They usually do." I nodded slowly. I'd already been preparing for that, even if I hadn't admitted it to myself. My phone buzzed. A text from my mother. "Your brother just called. He's devastated. How could you do this to him?" I showed the screen to David. "That was fast," he said. "The Navy moves slowly but family gossip moves at light speed." I turned the phone face down. "What happens next with the review?" "They'll interview Marcus, obviously. They'll interview people he's worked with, people who were involved in the projects in question. They'll review the documentation that was submitted against his official records. If there are discrepancies, they'll try to determine whether it was honest mistake or intentional misrepresentation. The whole thing probably takes 4 to 6 weeks. And in the meantime, your brother is going to be under a cloud. His command assignment that was supposed to start in August might get delayed. People are going to be watching him very carefully. And your family is going to be in crisis mode." I thought about the meeting Admiral Hutchinson was setting up for me, the possibility of leaving the department entirely and starting fresh somewhere that didn't have the Bennett family history attached to it. The timing was almost too perfect. David seemed to read my mind. "You're thinking about leaving," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I'm thinking about a lot of things," I said. He nodded. "For what it's worth, I think you'd be better off outside the Navy system entirely. You're good at what you do, but this environment is always going to be complicated for you. Too much history, too many people who see you as Marcus's sister first and Victoria Bennett second." We sat in silence for a few minutes, watching planes land and people take photos, and the river flow passed on its way to the Chesapeake Bay. The normalcy of it all felt surreal against the conversation we just had. Eventually David stood. "I need to get back before someone notices I took a long lunch. But Victoria, if you need anything, documentation or a reference, or just someone to talk to who isn't going to immediately tell your mother, call me. Rachel and I both think you've gotten a raw deal." "Thank you," I said. "I mean it." He squeezed my shoulder briefly and walked back toward the parking area. I stayed on the bench, watching the planes and thinking about what came next. My phone rang. An unknown number with the District of Columbia area code. I answered. "Victoria Bennett," I said. "Ms. Bennett, this is Margaret Klein. Admiral Hutchinson suggested I reach out to you. I understand you might be interested in exploring opportunities in the consulting space." Her voice was professional and warm, the kind of tone that put you at ease while still making clear she didn't waste time. "I am," I said. "Wonderful. Are you available Thursday afternoon? I'd love to sit down and discuss what we're working on and see if there might be a fit." "I can be," I said, mentally rearranging my schedule. "Excellent. Do you know the building at 1500 K Street? We're on the 9th floor. How does 3 o'clock sound?" "3 is perfect," I said. She gave me her direct number, and we ended the call. I sat holding my phone, watching another plane descend, and felt the shape of my life beginning to shift. Everything was happening very fast now, pieces falling into place or falling apart, and I wasn't entirely sure which. Both probably. I drove back to my apartment and found my mother waiting in the hallway outside my door. She was wearing sunglasses even though we were inside, which meant she'd been crying and didn't want me to see. My stomach sank. "We need to talk," she said. Her voice was tight and controlled. I unlocked the door and let her in. She walked straight to my living room and turned to face me, taking off the sunglasses. Her eyes were red and puffy, her makeup smudged at the corners. "How could you do this?" she said. Her voice broke on the last word. "Do what?" I said carefully. "Don't play games with me, Victoria. You filed a complaint against your own brother. You're trying to destroy his career because you're jealous." "Mom, I didn't file anything." "I don't believe you," she said flatly. "This has your fingerprints all over it. The timing, the documentation, the specific projects mentioned. Who else would know all of that? Who else would be vindictive enough to do this right after his promotion?" I felt anger rising in my chest, hot and sharp. "Vindictive," I repeated. "I spent 7 years writing papers and policies that Marcus presented as his own work. I made him look competent and he never once said thank you. And when I finally stopped being invisible, when someone finally acknowledged what I actually do, you all acted like I'd committed treason." "That's not what happened," my mother said. "You embarrassed him. You made him look bad in front of people who matter." "I made him look bad by existing," I said. "By having Admiral Hutchinson point out that I have a job and skills and value. The only way I could have avoided embarrassing Marcus was by staying invisible forever." My mother's face crumpled. "You don't understand what this is doing to him. They're reviewing his promotion. They're questioning his integrity. People are talking. Officers he respects are looking at him differently. His whole career could be destroyed." "Maybe his career should be destroyed if it was built on stolen work," I said quietly. She stared at me like I'd slapped her. "That's your brother," she said. "That's your family. How can you be so cold?" "I'm not cold," I said. "I'm just done lighting myself on fire to keep everyone else warm. Mom, I've given everything to this family. I've covered for Marcus since we were kids. I've made myself useful and quiet and convenient. And the one time I stood up for myself, the one time I stopped performing gratitude for being used, you all acted like I'd betrayed you." "We didn't use you," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "We asked for your help." "You asked for my help and then took credit for the results," I said. "There's a difference." She looked down at her hands, twisting her wedding ring around her finger. Your father thinks you should resign from the department, she said quietly. He thinks it's the only way to show that you're putting family first. He thinks if you step away, the review might lose momentum. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. He wants me to quit my job. To protect Marcus, she said. To show that family loyalty matters more than career. I walked to the window and looked out at the river, trying to control my breathing. The audacity of it was almost impressive. They wanted me to sacrifice my career, my reputation, my financial stability, to protect my brother from the consequences of his own actions. And they genuinely seemed to believe this was a reasonable request. No, I said, turning back to face her. Absolutely not. Victoria, please. I'm not quitting my job because Marcus got caught, I said. I'm not falling on my sword so he can keep his promotion. And I'm not going to keep having this conversation where you all pretend that asking me to disappear is somehow an act of love. My mother stood, picking up her purse. You're going to regret this, she said. When your brother's career is ruined and your father won't speak to you and everyone in the family knows what you did, you're going to wish you'd handled this differently. Maybe, I said. Or maybe I'll finally get to build a life that doesn't require me to be smaller than I am. She walked to the door and paused with her hand on the knob. I don't know who you are anymore, she said softly. I'm the same person I've always been, I replied. You just never bothered to look. She left without another word. And I stood in my living room listening to her footsteps fade down the hallway. My hands were shaking. I sat down on the couch and let myself cry, not from sadness but from the sheer weight of it all. The grief of realizing that your family loves a version of you that doesn't actually exist, and they'll punish you for becoming real. Wednesday morning I woke up to 17 missed calls and a voicemail from my father that I deleted without listening to. I got ready for work mechanically, moving through the routine on autopilot. My reflection in the mirror looked tired but determined, and I spent an extra minute on makeup trying to cover the evidence of yesterday's tears. At the Pentagon, Jennifer met me at my office door with coffee and a sympathetic expression. Your brother's office called 4 times already, she said. They want to schedule a meeting with you. Tell them I'm unavailable, I said. She hesitated. The last call was from a Captain Morrison. She said it was important and personal, not official. I looked up. That was the officer who'd texted me after the promotion party. Call her back and tell her I can meet. For lunch if she's available. Jennifer nodded and disappeared. I spent the morning in back-to-back meetings that had been scheduled weeks ago, discussing budget allocations and program assessments and congressional testimony preparation. It was surreal to sit in conference rooms talking about mundane policy details while my personal life was imploding, but it was also steadying in a way. This work existed independent of my family drama. These problems needed solving whether or not my brother's career was under review. Around noon, Jennifer stuck her head in during a brief break. Captain Morrison can meet you at the courtyard at 12:30. I nodded and finished the meeting, then headed down to the Pentagon's center courtyard. The day was warm and bright, and the food trucks were doing steady business. I spotted Captain Morrison standing near the benches, wearing her service khakis and looking composed despite the heat. She saw me and walked over, extending her hand. Thank you for meeting me, she said as we shook. Of course, I replied. Should we walk? She nodded and we started a slow circuit of the courtyard, moving away from clusters of other personnel. I wanted to reach out, she began, because I've been watching what's happening and I think you should know that you have more support than you might realize. I appreciated her directness. What do you mean? There are a lot of women in the Navy, uniformed and civilian, who've experienced some version of what you described at that party. We've all watched men take credit for our work, or been told to be team players when what they really mean is be invisible. When Admiral Hutchinson called that out, when he put a name and face to something we'd all been quietly experiencing, it mattered. She paused as we passed a group of junior officers. I've heard through informal channels that there are at least a dozen women who are willing to provide statements about similar patterns they've observed. Not just with your brother but across the system. If this review turns into something bigger, if there's an opportunity to actually examine how credit and recognition get distributed, there are people who want to help. I wasn't sure what to say. The idea that my personal family drama might become part of a larger systemic conversation was both empowering and terrifying. I didn't file the complaint, I said quietly. I know, she replied. Or at least I believe you. But whether you filed it or not, It's surface questions that a lot of us have been asking for years. The system doesn't work for everyone equally, and maybe this is a chance to actually talk about that. What do you need from me? I asked. Right now? Nothing. I just wanted you to know you're not alone in this. And if you need references or documentation or someone to speak up about your actual contributions, there are people ready to do that. We completed the circuit and stopped near where we'd started. She checked her watch. I need to get back, but Victoria, whatever happens with your family, you've started something important. Don't let them convince you that standing up for yourself was wrong. Thank you, I said. She nodded and headed back toward her office building, and I stood in the courtyard feeling the ground shift beneath my feet once again. Thursday afternoon I drove to downtown Washington for my meeting with Margaret Klein. The building at 1500 K Street was all glass and steel, the kind of place where serious decisions got made behind closed doors. I signed in at security, took the elevator to the 9th floor, and found myself in a reception area that managed to be both elegant and understated. Soft gray walls, modern furniture, a view of the city that reminded you this firm operated at altitude. Margaret Klein came out to meet me herself. A woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a handshake that conveyed both warmth and assessment. She led me back to a corner office where two other people were waiting, a former Air Force colonel named Thomas Wright, and a woman named Sandra Park who'd spent 20 years at the State Department. We spent the next 2 hours talking about defense policy, about the gaps between what the Pentagon said it wanted and what it actually needed, about the challenges of translating military requirements into language that Congress could fund and the public could support. They asked about my work, and for the first time in years I talked about it without minimizing or deflecting. I described the family support policies I'd developed, the crisis communications frameworks I'd built, the congressional testimony I'd drafted that had secured funding for programs that actually helped sailors. I told them about the research I'd done on retention and morale, about the data analysis that had identified which benefits mattered most to military families. I showed them work samples I'd brought, documents with my name on them that demonstrated scope and impact. Margaret leaned back in her chair and exchanged glances with her colleagues. This is exactly the kind of strategic thinking we need, she said. We work with defense contractors, with advocacy organizations, with congressional offices that are trying to make smart decisions about military policy. They need someone who understands both the operational realities and the political constraints, someone who can write clearly and think systemically. She named a salary that was 40% higher than what I currently made. She described benefits that included actual work-life balance, professional development budgets, and the freedom to put my name on my own work. She talked about projects they were pursuing, partnerships with organizations I respected, opportunities to shape policy from outside the bureaucracy where I might actually have more influence than I did inside it. The catch, Thomas said, leaning forward, is that this work requires a certain amount of visibility. You'd be the face of some of these initiatives. You'd be presenting at conferences, briefing senior officials, writing under your own byline. If you're someone who prefers to work behind the scenes, this might not be the right fit. I thought about the years I'd spent behind scenes I hadn't chosen, making other people look good because that's what was expected. I thought about Admiral Hutchinson's question at the promotion party, about Captain Morrison's words in the courtyard, about David's observation that I'd always be Marcus's sister first inside the Navy system. I'm ready to be visible, I said. Margaret smiled. Then let's make this official. We'd like to offer you a senior consultant position starting as soon as you can extricate yourself from your current role. Given what we know about the situation, she paused delicately, we understand if you need a few weeks to manage the transition. But we'd love to have you by mid-June if possible. I felt something unlock in my chest, a tension I'd been carrying so long I'd forgotten it was there. Yes, I said. Absolutely yes. We spent another 30 minutes working through logistics and paperwork, and then I was back in the elevator, back out onto K Street, walking toward my car with an offer letter in my bag, and a completely different future taking shape. I sat in the driver's seat and called Admiral Hutchinson. He answered on the second ring. I take it the meeting went well, he said. I could hear the smile in his voice. They offered me the job, I said. I start in June. Outstanding, he said. You're going to do excellent work there, Victoria, and you're going to get credit for it. Thank you, I said, and my voice caught slightly. For seeing me. For saying something. For all of it. I didn't do anything you weren't ready to do yourself, he replied. I just gave you permission to stop asking for it. When I got home, my phone showed 6 missed calls from Marcus. I stared at his name on the screen and felt nothing, not anger, not guilt, just a kind of distant curiosity about what he might possibly have to say. I called him back. He answered immediately. "Where have you been?" he demanded. His voice was tight and strained. "I've been trying to reach you for days." "I've been working," I said calmly. "Marcus, I don't have time for this. Whatever you think I did, whatever Mom and Dad told you, I didn't file a complaint against you." "You expect me to believe that?" he said. "Yes," I said. "Because it's true. But honestly, whether you believe me or not isn't my problem anymore." There was a pause. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I'm done, Marcus. I'm done covering for you, I'm done making excuses, I'm done pretending that the way this family works is normal or acceptable. I'm leaving the Department of the Navy. I got a job offer with a consulting firm and I'm taking it." "You're quitting," he said, and he sounded genuinely shocked. "Because of me. I'm leaving because staying means spending the rest of my career fighting for recognition from people who benefit from my invisibility," I said. "This has nothing to do with you and everything to do with me finally figuring out what I'm worth." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then his voice came back different, smaller. "The review board interviewed 3 of my former colleagues today," he said. "They asked a lot of questions about who actually did the work on specific projects. They have documentation, emails, file metadata. Victoria, they know. I didn't say anything. If they find that I misrepresented my contributions," his voice cracked slightly, "I could lose my promotion. I could lose my command. I could get passed over for the rest of my career." I thought about all the times I'd fixed things for him, all the nights I'd stayed up rewriting his work, all the moments I'd made him look competent when he wasn't. I thought about the paper I'd written for him in college that kept him from failing out. I thought about the car accident I'd taken the blame for, the expenses I'd covered, the lies I'd told to protect him. I thought about standing in that gallery holding a tray of crab cakes while he accepted praise for my ideas. "What do you want me to do?" I asked quietly. "I want you to tell them the truth," he said. "That we collaborated. That it was a team effort. That the work was shared and you never intended for people to think otherwise." "You want me to lie?" I said. "I want you to help me," he said. And now his voice had an edge of desperation. "I'm your brother. Doesn't that mean anything to you?" "Used to," I said. "But you taught me that family means one person doing all the work while someone else takes all the credit. You taught me that love means making yourself small so other people can feel big. You taught me that loyalty means sacrificing everything while getting nothing back. So yeah, Marcus, it means something. It means I finally learned the lesson you've been teaching me my whole life." I hung up before he could respond. My phone rang again immediately. I turned it off completely and sat in the silence of my apartment. Outside, the sun was setting over the river, turning everything gold and pink and amber. I thought about the decision I just made, about the family I was walking away from, about the career I was leaving behind. I thought about all the versions of myself I'd performed over the years, the dutiful daughter, the supportive sister, the invisible expert, the woman who made everyone else comfortable at the expense of her own dignity. I was done performing. I was done asking permission to exist. I was done waiting for people to see me who had spent years training themselves to look away. The next morning I drafted my resignation letter. It was brief and professional, thanking the department for the opportunity and giving 4 weeks' notice. I didn't explain. I didn't justify. I just stated my intention to leave and offered to help with the transition. I sent it to my supervisor and copied human resources, and then I started the process of documenting everything I was working on, creating transition plans for projects that would need new owners, organizing files in a way that would make sense to whoever replaced me. Jennifer appeared in my doorway around 10 with an expression that managed to be both sad and proud. "You're really leaving," she said. "I'm really leaving," I confirmed. She nodded slowly. "I'm going to miss working with you. But I think you're doing the right thing." I smiled at her. "Thank you for always seeing the work," I said. "Even when nobody else did." She waved a hand dismissively. "Everyone on this floor saw it. We just didn't have the power to do anything about it." Then she hesitated. "For what it's worth, I heard that the review board is expanding their investigation. They're not just looking at your brother anymore. They're examining how credit and recognition get distributed across several programs. People are calling it the Bennett effect." I blinked. "What?" "Apparently after Admiral Hutchinson's comments at the party, and then the formal complaint, A bunch of other people started asking questions about similar patterns. Women mostly, but not exclusively. People who've been doing work that gets attributed to their supervisors or colleagues. The review board decided to look at it systematically. I sat back in my chair trying to process this. My personal family drama had somehow sparked a broader examination of institutional problems. I wasn't sure whether to be proud or horrified. It's causing a lot of discomfort, Jennifer continued. A lot of senior people are suddenly having to account for where their ideas actually came from. But it's also validating a lot of people who felt invisible for years. You started something important. I didn't start anything, I said. I just stopped hiding. She smiled. Sometimes that's the same thing. The next few weeks passed in a strange blur of endings and beginnings. I worked through my notice period, training my replacement and transferring projects and saying goodbye to colleagues who'd become friends. Some people treated me normally, like my leaving was just another career move. Others were awkward, clearly aware of the family drama and unsure what to say. A few pulled me aside to tell me they admired what I'd done, that they'd been watching similar dynamics play out in their own careers and hadn't known how to address it. Captain Morrison took me to lunch my last week and told me that the review board had made preliminary findings. Marcus's promotion to captain was being suspended pending additional investigation. Several of his performance evaluations were being re-examined, and the broader study of attribution practices had revealed patterns that were making a lot of people uncomfortable. They're calling it a systemic cultural issue, she said, which is bureaucracy speak for we've been doing this wrong for a long time and now we have to figure out how to fix it. What happens to Marcus? I asked. She shrugged. Honestly, probably nothing catastrophic. He'll likely keep his rank, maybe get quietly moved to a less visible position. The Navy doesn't like public scandals, but his trajectory as a rising star is probably over. He'll plateau somewhere comfortable and spend the rest of his career being competent enough not to get fired but never quite trusted with anything important. I thought about my brother, about the future he'd imagined for himself and how different it would look now. I tried to feel sympathy and mostly felt tired. He made his choices, I said. Now he gets to live with them. Just like I'm living with mine. Morrison nodded. For what it's worth, you're handling this with a lot more grace than most people would. I don't feel graceful, I said. I feel like I burned down my entire life. You didn't burn it down, she replied. You just stopped pretending the foundation was solid when it was actually rotting. There's a difference. My last day at the Pentagon was a Friday in early June. The weather was beautiful, one of those perfect spring days when Washington almost manages to be charming. I cleaned out my office, packed up the few personal items I'd accumulated, and said goodbye to Jennifer and the handful of people who'd made the work bearable. Admiral Hutchinson sent flowers with a note that said simply, "Onward." I hadn't spoken to my parents in 3 weeks. They'd tried calling a few times in the first week after I resigned, but when I didn't answer they'd stopped. Marcus had sent one text that I'd deleted without reading. The silence from my family was both painful and liberating. I'd spent so long trying to maintain connection with people who only valued me for my usefulness that I'd forgotten what it felt like to just exist without performing. I drove home that Friday evening and sat on my balcony watching planes land at Reagan National, the same way I'd done dozens of times before. But everything felt different now. The future that had seemed so fixed and predetermined was suddenly open and uncertain. I was starting a new job on Monday with people who'd hired me for my actual skills, where I'd be visible and credited and compensated fairly. I was 34 years old and finally building a life that belonged to me. It was terrifying. It was also the freest I'd ever felt. Saturday morning I went for a long run along the river, pushing myself until my legs burned and my lungs ached. When I got back to my apartment, I found an envelope that had been slipped under my door. My name was written on it in handwriting I didn't recognize. Inside was a short note on heavy paper. Victoria, I heard about your resignation and wanted to reach out. I'm a lieutenant commander in the Judge Advocate General's Corps. I've been working in Navy legal for 6 years, and I've watched several situations similar to yours play out. I've seen talented people leave because they couldn't get recognition, and I've seen mediocre people advance because they were good at claiming credit for other people's work. What you did at that promotion party, just by existing visibly and having someone acknowledge your contributions, has started conversations that are long overdue. The review of attribution practices is expanding. People are talking openly about dynamics they've observed for years but never felt safe naming. You didn't just stand up for yourself. You created space for other people to stand up too. I know you're leaving the Navy system and I understand why. But I wanted you to know that your impact here will continue long after you're gone. Thank you for being brave enough to stop being invisible. The note was unsigned, but it didn't need a signature. I read it 3 times, standing in my kitchen in my running clothes, and felt tears prick at my eyes. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of being seen. Sunday I forced myself to deal with the one conversation I'd been avoiding. I called my father. He answered on the 4th ring, his voice formal and distant. Victoria. Hi Dad, I said. I wanted to talk to you before I start my new job tomorrow. There was a pause. I heard your brother's promotion has been suspended, he said. His tone was flat, accusatory. I heard that too, I said. I'm sorry it turned out this way. Are you, he asked. Because from where I'm sitting it looks like you got exactly what you wanted. You destroyed your brother's career and walked away to a better job. Is that really what you think happened, I asked. I think you made a choice to put yourself ahead of your family, he said. I think you decided that your pride was more important than your brother's future. And I think you're going to look back on this someday and realize what you threw away. I stood at my window looking out at the river, at the city beyond it, at the life I'd built despite every obstacle my family had placed in my way. Dad, I said quietly, I spent 11 years writing Marcus's work for him. I made him look good at my own expense. I asked for recognition exactly once, and instead of getting it, I was handed an apron and told to serve food. I didn't destroy his career. I stopped building it for him. There's a difference. Your mother is heartbroken, he said, ignoring everything I just said. She feels like she's lost a daughter. Tell her she hasn't lost a daughter, I said. She just has to decide whether she wants to know the daughter she actually has, or keep mourning the one she invented who only existed to make everyone else comfortable. My father was quiet for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was tired. I don't know what you want from us, Victoria. I want you to see me, I said. That's all I've ever wanted. To be seen and valued for who I actually am, not for how useful I can be. But if you can't do that, if the only version of me you can love is the one who stays small and quiet and grateful for scraps, then maybe Mom's right. Maybe you have lost a daughter, because that person doesn't exist anymore. I hung up before he could respond. My hands were shaking but my breathing was steady. I'd said what I needed to say. What they did with it was up to them. Monday morning I put on a Navy suit and drove into the city for my first day at Klein Strategic Consulting. The office was bright and modern, with actual windows and coffee that didn't taste like it had been sitting in a pot. Since dawn, Margaret Klein met me in the lobby and walked me through introductions, showing me my office, a real office with a door and a desk that faced windows overlooking the street, and explaining the projects I'd be working on. Everyone I met seemed genuinely glad I was there. They asked about my expertise and listened to my answers. They talked about collaboration and attribution and making sure credit went to the people who did the work. It felt almost surreal after years of fighting for basic recognition. My first project was developing a policy brief on military family support services for a congressional committee that was considering funding legislation. It was work I knew intimately, work I'd done versions of for years. But this time my name would be on it. This time when I presented it, I'd be the one standing at the podium. Margaret stopped by my office around noon. How's the first morning going, she asked. It's good, I said. Really good. She smiled. I'm glad to hear it. Listen, I wanted to mention something. Admiral Hutchinson sits on our advisory board, and he suggested that you might be interested in writing a piece for one of the defense policy journals about the importance of attribution and recognition in government service. Nothing that violates confidentiality or throws anyone under the bus, just a thoughtful analysis of how the system works and how it might work better. I thought about it. A public piece with my name on it, talking about issues that were deeply personal but also systemically important. It was exactly the kind of visibility I told Thomas Wright I was ready for. I'd like that, I said. Excellent, Margaret replied. I'll send you the editor's contact information. Take your time with it, but I think you have something important to say. After she left, I sat at my desk looking out at the city. Somewhere across town, Marcus was probably dealing with the review board. Somewhere in Virginia, my parents were probably discussing what a disappointment I'd turned out to be. And I was here in an office with my name on the door, getting paid to do work that mattered under my own name. I wasn't invisible anymore. I wasn't anyone's support staff or secret weapon or convenient resource. I was just Victoria Bennett doing good work and getting credit for it. It had taken 11 years and a family implosion to get here. But I'd finally arrived. 3 months later, I was sitting in a conference room on Capitol Hill, presenting the family support policy brief to a subcommittee of staffers and military liaisons. My name was on every page. When they asked questions, they directed them to me. When they praised the analysis, they thanked me specifically. After the presentation, one of the senior staffers pulled me aside. "This is excellent work," she said. "We've been trying to get traction on these issues for years, but nobody's put it together this clearly before. We'd love to work with your firm on the implementation phase if the funding comes through." I handed her my card. "I'd love that," I said. As I walked out of the building into the late summer sunshine, my phone buzzed with a text from David Park. "Saw your testimony got quoted in the Navy Times. Your parents are going to see it." "I know," I replied. "How do you feel about that?" he asked. I thought about it for a moment, standing on the steps of a building where laws got made, where my work was being taken seriously, where my name meant something. "Honestly, feel fine." "Good," he wrote back. "You should. Rachel and I are proud of you." That evening I met Admiral Hutchinson for dinner at a restaurant in Georgetown. We'd fallen into a pattern of monthly check-ins, conversations that were part mentorship and part friendship. He asked about my projects, about how I was adjusting to consulting work, about whether I was happy. I told him about the congressional presentation, about the projects in the pipeline, about the article I'd written that would be published next month in the Naval War College Review. I told him it felt surreal to have my name on work, to be building a reputation that belonged to me. He listened with that patient attention he was known for, and when I finished he raised his glass. "To visibility," he said, "and to the courage it takes to claim it." We drank to that. Then he set down his glass and his expression turned more serious. "I heard your brother accepted a reassignment to a staff position in San Diego," he said. "It's a lateral move, technically not a demotion, but everyone knows what it means. He'll finish his career there doing perfectly adequate work that nobody will remember. How do you feel about that?" I considered the question honestly. I felt sad for the brother I'd thought I had when we were kids, before the patterns solidified and the expectations calcified. I felt sad for the family dinners we'd never have and the relationship that might have existed in some other version of our lives. But I didn't feel guilty. I didn't feel responsible. Marcus had made choices every step of the way, and so had my parents. They'd chosen convenience over integrity, comfort over honesty, the easy story over the complicated truth. Those were their choices to own. "I feel sad," I said finally, "but I also feel free." Admiral Hutchinson nodded. "That's the right answer," he said. "You can grieve what might have been while still protecting what is. They're not mutually exclusive." By the time fall arrived, my life had settled into a rhythm that felt sustainable. I worked on projects I cared about with people who respected me. I made more money than I ever had at the Pentagon. I had time for long runs and dinners with friends and evenings when I did absolutely nothing. I went on dates with a State Department analyst David had introduced me to, someone who understood the peculiar culture of Washington and didn't need me to explain why visibility mattered. Captain Morrison and I had coffee every few weeks, trading stories about the ongoing cultural assessment at the Pentagon and the slow grinding work of institutional change. The review of attribution practices had expanded into a broader examination of mentorship, promotion, and recognition. It was bureaucratic and imperfect and glacially slow, but it was happening. Some people were angry about it. Some people were defensive. But some people, especially younger officers and mid-level civilians who'd been watching talented colleagues leave for years, were grateful. I got emails occasionally from people I'd never met, thanking me for starting a conversation, for making it possible to name dynamics they'd experienced but hadn't known how to articulate. Each one felt like a small vindication. In October, my article was published. The title was Attribution and Accountability, Rethinking Recognition and Defense Policy. It was academic and measured, full of citations and careful language. But the argument underneath was personal. Organizations that fail to properly attribute work create cultures of exploitation. They lose talented people who get tired of being invisible. They promote mediocrity because the metrics they use to evaluate performance are disconnected from actual contribution. And they perpetuate systems where visibility and credit flow toward people who already have power, while the people actually doing the work remain in the shadows. The article got attention. It was shared widely on defense policy social media. It was assigned in some graduate programs that focused on public administration. I got invited to speak at a conference about women in national security. And somewhere in San Diego, Marcus presumably read it and knew exactly what I was talking about, even though I'd never mentioned him by name. My mother called in November. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. "Victoria," she said. Her voice was tentative, nothing like the cold anger of our last conversation. "Hi, Mom," I said carefully. "I read your article," she said. I paused, unsure where this was going. And I think I'm starting to understand," she said slowly, "why you were so angry. I talked to some other Navy wives, women whose daughters or daughters-in-law work in defense, and a lot of them told me stories that sounded familiar. Stories about talented women doing important work and watching men take credit. Stories about families that expected daughters to be supportive and sons to be successful." She paused. "I don't know if I can fix what happened between us, but I want you to know that I'm trying to see it differently." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even close to everything I needed to hear. But it was the first time my mother had ever acknowledged that maybe, possibly, the problem wasn't entirely my fault. "That's a start," I said quietly. "I'd like to see you," she said. "Maybe have lunch. If you're willing." I thought about all the ways this could go wrong, all the old patterns we could fall back into, all the hurt that still sat between us. But I also thought about the fact that people could change, slowly and imperfectly, if they wanted to. "Okay," I said. "Let's try lunch." We made plans for the following week. And when we hung up, I sat holding my phone and feeling something I hadn't felt in months when I thought about my family. Not hope exactly, but not despair either. Just the possibility that maybe, eventually, we could find a way to exist in each other's lives that didn't require me to be invisible. That evening I stood on my balcony watching the sun set over the Potomac, the same view I'd had since I moved to this apartment 3 years ago. The city lights were starting to come on, scattered across the landscape like stars. Planes descended toward the airport in their patient queue. The river flowed past on its way to somewhere else, steady and unstoppable. I thought about the woman I'd been a year ago, standing in a gallery serving crab cakes to people who didn't see me. I thought about the apron I'd tied around my waist, the paper I'd written, the credit I'd handed away, the lifetime of making myself smaller so other people could feel bigger. That version of me felt very far away now, like a story I'd heard about someone else. I'd lost things to get here. I'd lost the comfortable fiction that my family would eventually recognize my worth if I just kept trying. I'd lost the security of a job where I knew how to navigate every political current. I'd lost the identity I'd built around being useful and accommodating and grateful for scraps. But I'd gained something too. I gained my name on my work. I'd gained the respect of people who valued competence over comfort. I'd gained mornings when I woke up and didn't immediately start calculating how to make someone else's life easier. I'd gained the ability to look at myself in the mirror and recognize the person looking back. The trade had been worth it. Standing there on my balcony in the cooling evening air, watching the city settle into night, I knew with absolute certainty that I would make the same choice again. I'd stopped being invisible, and I was never going back. The lunch with my mother happened on a cold Tuesday in late November at a small bistro in Old Town Alexandria, halfway between her house and my apartment. I arrived first and chose a table by the window where the afternoon light was soft and forgiving. When she walked in, I barely recognized her for a moment. She looked older somehow, or maybe just more uncertain. The confidence she usually wore like armor had been replaced by something more fragile. We hugged briefly, awkwardly, and sat down across from each other with menus we pretended to study. "How have you been?" she asked finally, setting her menu aside. "Busy," I said. "Good, busy. The work is challenging and I'm learning a lot." She nodded, her hands folded on the table. "I've been following your career. The article you wrote was in the Navy Times newsletter. Several people mentioned it at the Officers' Wives Club meeting. I wasn't sure how to respond to that." "Thank you," I said carefully. "Your father read it too," she continued. "He didn't say much, but I could tell it affected him. He's not good at admitting when he's wrong." "I know," I said. We ordered food and spent a few minutes in small talk about the weather and the holidays in her garden. Then she took a breath and looked directly at me. "I owe you an apology," she said. "For a lot of things, but especially for what happened at Marcus's promotion party. I should never have asked you to serve food. I should never have made you feel like your role in this family was to make everyone else look good while staying in the background." The words hung in the air between us. I'd imagined this conversation 100 times, rehearsed what I might say, how I might respond. But now that it was actually happening, I found I didn't have a script. "Why did you?" I asked quietly. "Why did you always ask me to be smaller?" She looked down at her hands. "Because it was easier," she said. "Marcus was always more difficult, more demanding of attention. You were self-sufficient and capable, and I think we took advantage of that. We told ourselves you didn't need the same support because you were strong enough to handle things on your own. But that wasn't fair. Strength isn't an excuse to be taken for granted." I felt something loosen in my chest, a knot I'd been carrying for so long I'd forgotten it was there. It wasn't everything I needed to hear. It didn't erase years of being overlooked. But it was real and it was honest, and that mattered. "Thank you for saying that," I said. My mother reached across the table and took my hand. "I'm proud of you," she said, and her voice cracked slightly. "I should have said that years ago. I should have said it every time you accomplish something instead of expecting you to just keep accomplishing things quietly. You've built an incredible career, and you did it despite us, not because of us. I'm sorry it took me so long to see that." We talked for 2 hours, longer than I'd expected. She told me about the conversations she'd been having with other military families, about the patterns she was starting to recognize and how they talked about their children's careers. She told me about a friend whose daughter had left the Air Force after being passed over for promotions while less qualified men advanced. She told me about slowly realizing that the world she'd taken for granted, where men led and women supported, was more complicated and more unjust than she'd wanted to acknowledge. I told her about my new job, about the projects I was working on, about the satisfaction of seeing my name on work that mattered. I told her about the emails I'd received from other women in defense, about the slow institutional changes that were starting to happen at the Pentagon. I told her I was happy, genuinely happy, in a way I hadn't been in years. "What about Marcus?" she asked eventually. "Have you talked to him?" "No," I said. "I don't think I'm ready for that yet." She nodded. "He's struggling," she said quietly. "The reassignment to San Diego was hard on him. Amber is unhappy about the move. He knows his career isn't going to go where he thought it would." I felt a pang of something, not quite sympathy but not satisfaction either. "I'm sorry he's having a hard time," I said. "But Mom, he made choices. He took credit for work he didn't do. He built a reputation on a foundation that wasn't his. Those consequences are his to deal with." "I know," she said. "Your father and I enabled that. We made it easy for him to take shortcuts because we were so focused on his success that we didn't think about the cost." She paused. "He needs to figure out who he is when he can't rely on your work. That's going to take time." We said goodbye in the parking lot with another brief hug and a promise to do this again. As I drove back to Arlington, I felt lighter somehow. The conversation hadn't fixed everything. There were still years of hurt to work through, patterns to unlearn, trust to rebuild. But it was a beginning. And maybe that was enough for now. December brought the first real snow of the season, and with it a kind of quiet that settles over Washington when the city pauses between autumn's chaos and the New Year's fresh start. I threw myself into work, finalizing a major project on military spouse employment that would be presented to Congress in January. The consulting firm was growing, and Margaret had started talking about bringing me on as a partner if the next year went well. I was building something that belonged to me brick by brick, and it felt solid in a way nothing had before. One evening I was working late at the office when my phone rang. An unknown number with a California area code. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won. "Hello," I said. "Victoria, it's Marcus." His voice was different than I remembered, quieter somehow, less certain. I set down my pen and leaned back in my chair. "Hi, Marcus. I wasn't sure you'd answer," he said. "I wasn't sure I would either," I replied honestly. There was a pause. "I've been wanting to call for months," he said. I kept picking up the phone and putting it down. I didn't know what to say. I waited, letting the silence stretch. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "For all of it. For taking credit for your work. For not acknowledging what you did. For making you feel invisible. For letting mom and dad treat you like you only mattered when you were useful. For the promotion party. For everything. I closed my eyes, listening to the words I'd needed to hear for so long. Why now, I asked. Because I've had a lot of time to think, he said. The reassignment, the review, watching my career stall while yours takes off. First I was angry. I blamed you. I told myself you'd sabotaged me out of jealousy. But the more I sat with it, the more I realized that you didn't do anything to me. You just stopped doing things for me. And without that, I had to face the fact that I wasn't as good as everyone thought I was. He took a breath and continued. I've been seeing a therapist out here. Amber insisted on it. We've been talking about a lot of things, but one pattern that keeps coming up is how I've gone through life taking what was offered and never thinking about the cost to other people. I did it with you. I did it with colleagues. I did it because it was easy and because nobody stopped me. He paused. You were right to walk away. You were right to stop covering for me. I needed to face consequences, and I never would have if you'd kept protecting me. I opened my eyes and looked out at the city lights, scattered across the darkness like a constellation. Thank you for saying that, I said quietly. I mean it, he said. I don't expect you to forgive me right away. I don't even know if I deserve forgiveness. But I wanted you to know that I see it now. I see what I took from you and I'm sorry. We talked for another 20 minutes, carefully navigating years of complicated history. He told me about his new position, about the humbling experience of doing work that didn't come with automatic praise. He told me about therapy, about recognizing patterns from childhood that had shaped how he moved through the world. He told me he was trying to be better, not for his career but because he didn't like who he'd been. I told him I was glad he was doing that work. I told him I wasn't ready to go back to the way things were, that trust would take a long time to rebuild if it could be rebuilt at all. But I also told him I appreciated him calling, that it mattered to hear him take responsibility without making excuses. When we hung up, I sat in my office for a long time, watching snow fall past the windows. The conversation hadn't erased the past. It hadn't made everything okay. But it had opened a door that I thought was permanently closed. What I did with that door was still my choice. And for now, leaving it slightly ajar felt like enough. The new year arrived with the usual flurry of resolutions and fresh starts. Margaret officially offered me a partnership position at the firm, contingent on bringing in 2 major contracts over the next 6 months. I accepted immediately and threw myself into business development, reaching out to contacts I'd built over years in government, pitching projects that combined policy expertise with strategic communications. By March, I'd secured 3 contracts, including one with a major veterans advocacy organization. The work was challenging and visible in mine. My name was on everything. When I succeeded, I got credit. When I made mistakes, I owned them. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. I started speaking at conferences, not as someone's assistant or ghostwriter but as an expert in my own right. I wrote more articles, some academic and some for popular audiences, about defense policy and institutional culture and the importance of attribution. My professional reputation grew steadily, built on actual accomplishments rather than borrowed glory. In April, Admiral Hutchinson invited me to join the advisory board of a new initiative focused on improving military family support systems. The board included former senior officers, policy experts, and advocacy leaders. I was the youngest person in the room and the only one who'd actually designed and implemented the programs. We were evaluating. My voice carried weight. People listened when I spoke. It still felt slightly surreal. My relationship with my mother continued to slowly repair itself. We had lunch once a month, careful conversations where we were both trying to build something new from the rubble of what had been. She asked about my work and actually listened to the answers. She stopped comparing me to Marcus or suggesting that family loyalty required sacrifice. She was learning, slowly and imperfectly, to see me as a whole person rather than a supporting character in someone else's story. My father was slower to come around. We spoke occasionally, brief phone calls that were polite but distant. He'd congratulated me on the partnership, a short email that acknowledged my success without really engaging with it. I didn't push. Some relationships heal and some just learn to coexist peacefully. I was okay with either outcome as long as it didn't require me to go back to being invisible. By summer, I'd been in my new career for a year. The anniversary passed without fanfare. Just another day of meetings and deadlines and the satisfying work of building something meaningful. But that evening, sitting on my balcony watching the sunset paint the Potomac in shades of gold and copper, I let myself reflect on how far I'd traveled. A year ago, I'd been standing in a gallery holding a tray of crab cakes, watching my brother accept praise for my work while my family smiled and nodded like this was exactly how things should be. I'd been invisible and useful and slowly dying inside from the weight of being neither seen nor valued. Now I was a partner at a respected consulting firm. I had contracts with my name on them and a reputation I'd built myself. I had relationships that were based on mutual respect rather than one-sided utility. I had mornings when I woke up excited about the work ahead, instead of dreading another day of making other people shine. I'd lost things too. My relationship with Marcus was cordial but distant, careful phone calls every few months that never quite achieved real intimacy. My relationship with my father might never fully heal. There were family gatherings I wasn't invited to and conversations that stopped when I entered rooms. Some bridges don't get rebuilt. They just burn down to the waterline and stay there as reminders. But the trade had been worth it. Every single day it was worth it. I thought about all the women who'd emailed me after reading my articles, who'd pulled me aside at conferences to tell me their own stories of invisible labor and stolen credit. I thought about the institutional reviews still happening at the Pentagon, the slow grinding work of cultural change. I thought about Jennifer and Captain Morrison and David Park, about all the people who'd seen the work even when it was meant to stay hidden. I thought about Admiral Hutchinson asking why the Deputy Assistant Secretary was serving drinks, about the way one moment of visibility had cracked open years of carefully maintained silence. Change happened in strange ways sometimes. It started with one person deciding they'd had enough, one moment of refusing to stay small, one act of claiming space that had always belonged to them. It rippled outward in ways you couldn't predict or control. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, it created something better than what had been there before. The sun dropped below the horizon and the city lights came on, thousands of windows glowing against the deepening blue of evening. Somewhere in that vast constellation of lives, other people were fighting their own battles for visibility, for recognition, for the basic dignity of being seen. Some of them would win. Some would lose. Some would find complicated middle grounds where victory and defeat blurred together. But all of them deserved better than I'd gotten. They deserved families that valued them for who they were, not how useful they could be. They deserved workplaces that credited them properly. They deserved to build lives where their success was visible and celebrated, rather than hidden and exploited. I couldn't fix the whole system, but I could keep doing good work under my own name. I could keep speaking up about attribution and accountability. I could keep opening doors for the people coming behind me, making sure they didn't have to fight as hard as I had to be seen. That felt like enough. That felt like purpose. I stood up and went inside, closing the balcony door against the cooling evening air. Tomorrow I had a presentation to finalize, a new client to meet, a dozen small tasks that would add up to something meaningful. Tomorrow I would show up as myself, fully visible, no longer performing invisibility to make someone else comfortable. And that finally was exactly where I wanted to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.